part of the reason I got involved with a volunteer organization called Better Angels shortly after the 2016 election, and it's now been changed to Braver Angels, is because of this exact situation. Right after the election, people were immediately reporting that they were losing, friends on Facebook. They were losing family members who refused to talk to them. And so a man named David Blankenhorn founded this around the concept of teaching people how to depolarize. And he wanted it to be citizen-led. So they developed workshops that I ended up engaging in and learning to give to the community, and teach people how to have conversations between political opposites. And again, that kind of is the impetus behind writing the book, was to get the word out even more that this really is possible. But first, I just really think we have to acknowledge the current state we're in, that we are under this very anxious state. And because we're talking to educators or in that frame today, I just want to sort of offer something that I think might be causing a ramped up level of anxiety right now. And this kind of just came to me today that, we teach our kids not to bully. We have anti-bullying campaigns at school. We have online anti-bullying and all these things. And we tell them, this is wrong, don't do it. And then we turn around and become the worst version of our fifth grade selves when it comes to politics. And it's kind of shameful. It's like, how can we, say, don't do this, and then turn around and do it? And I really believe that this rhetoric, this level of bullying that we've begun to engage in on both sides, is producing the anxiety. So we have to sort of backpedal on that and learn where do we go with that, and kind of reverse the cycle.
And so where do we go with that?
Where do we go with that? Well, so I have like 5 tips, and it starts with looking at our own bias. Number 1, you have to examine your own bias. And Braver Angels has some exercises for this, and they're depolarized within workshop. But to kind of just give you an example of what that looks like, if you're talking to someone who already agrees with you about politics, try to notice if you ever make statements that are painting with a broad brush, because I think nothing defines bias more than when we broad brush paint something. So I thought it might be kind of fun if you and I practice this really quick. A little role play.
I love it. Okay. Are we on the same side?
We're going to be on the same side. I don't know what side. I haven't asked you what side you're on, but we're going to pretend that we are both Republicans.
Okay.
And all I want you to do is ask me what I think about the Democrats' chances in the upcoming election. And I'm going to say some things, and then I want you to analyze what I've said and point out to me where I have painted with broad brush.
Okay.
So ask me what I think.
What do I think about the Democrats? What was it again?
You're going to ask me, what do I think about the Democrats' chances in the election?
Okay.
Just something basic.
Okay. Hey, Julie.
Yeah.
What do you think about the Democratic chance of winning this election?
Well, I sure hope, it doesn't happen. I mean, from everything I can tell, Democrats they just want to bankrupt this country. All of them, every single one of them. All right, analyze my bias.
I mean, just speaking as like all Democrats are the same and all Democrats stand for the same thing.
Right. And so if we were to talk to a Democrat right now, and we would say individually to that person that we know that might be in our family, do you want to bankrupt the country? Is that your goal? We all know that they'd be like, what are you talking about?
Yeah.
And so that's the problem when we generalize a group, and it's a good way that we can figure out, oh, look what I'm doing. Okay, so instead of like painting the broad brush on the group, let's focus more on the individual. Let's focus on your friend or your family member or your neighbor. Are they really all those things that you're saying the other side is? And so you first have to get a little bit of a grasp on your own bias before you can kind of move through the next steps. Okay, so
And
step number
I just
two.
want to interrupt. Like,
Yeah, go ahead.
I love that so much because, bias is in every aspect of our lives. Like, we have bias in every aspect of our lives, and I think with anything, right? Like, if we're gonna sit around and have like, take out politics and insert Black Lives Matter. Take out politics and insert the state of education. It doesn't matter what the topic is that we're talking about. Like, we do these, like, right, like what you're talking about, we bring our bias to the table and we paint broad strokes for everything. Like, every white person must be a racist, or every Black person is a this, or every, like, every educator is a this, or I mean, I like what you're pointing out right now, is that, like, always first and foremost, and this is what I teach in my trainings. This is what I teach when I'm working with my clients one-on-one. It's like, when I do the anti-racism work, it's like, first things first is like, we get to do the personal growth and the reflection and the deep, hard work of digging deep and doing our own self-examination on things before and I really think that, I mean, you're really hitting the nail on the head. Like, this is a piece that I think is just so often overlooked because it's uncomfortable. People don't want to do it, like, I don't want you to uncover anything about me that could indicate that, like, maybe I'm not the best person in the world, or maybe I am not making the right decisions, or maybe I made a mistake, right? Like, it's so uncomfortable to have, like, mistakes reflected back at you. And so I think that's a big motivator for people to not go into that work of self-reflection and doing the personal growth.
It's so embedded. I remember listening to you one time on one of your race talks, and you shared like a blind spot that you had. And it made me think about something that happened even within this last year that exposed a completely embedded, I call it like malware, blind spot that I had in a racial situation. And it's really like kind of shocking. You're like, oh my gosh, So give yourself some, I guess, grace that, yeah, we all have these biases, we're working on them. But when it comes to politics, it's really good to like look at yourself first before you begin a conversation with someone on the other side.
Yeah, I love that. So sorry for interrupting. Go ahead and go on.
No. I love that, because that's so right on. The next thing I feel like we need to do is it's like mental preparation. You need to reframe this person not as a Democrat or a Republican, but as a human being that has a brain that has been wired differently than yours. This wiring comes from a lifetime of experiences, of things that have happened to them, things they have learned. And there are even like studies now talking about predisposition to certain, thinking, liberal versus conservative. So if we can just, it's almost like take that pause and just acknowledge their brain is different before we proceed. So that's my step number 2, is acknowledge that the brain is different. Step number 3 is, I call it attempt curiosity, because this is where you're going to figure out whether this conversation is going to go forward comfortable, or it's just going to ramp up in feeling even more anxious and tense. The first thing I recommend in attempting curiosity is they say something, maybe they throw out a fact that you don't think is true, maybe they say some broad brush bias thing. And of course, the first thing we want to do is jump on it and set the record straight, because we know the truth, But instead of doing that, just parrot back to them what they said. When you repeat what someone says, a lot of times it opens them the door for them to say, oh, in their head, okay, good, I can keep talking. Okay, yeah, you're right. That's what I just said. Now I'm going to tell you some more. Okay, perfect, fine. Now listen to what else they have to say. And then think about asking them a question, not a question that's a gotcha question, but more like something on the order of, so have you seen, like, do you know someone personally in your life that has benefited from that policy stance, or have you personally, what in your background led you to take that position? That's a great question, and then just listen. If it seems like things are going good, and this is not ramping up in the wrong way, number 4 is that you need to make a decision now. Do I engage or do I disengage? If this is not going well, it's time to disengage and just say, well, you know what? We're probably not going to agree about this. How are your kids doing? Just walk away, because we keep thinking we're going to be able to change their mind with our database of facts. And studies have just shown that facts do not change their minds. This is hardwiring we're dealing with.
Yeah. And I'd like that two things that are just kind of coming to mind for me in step 3, it immediately made me think of Stephen Covey's, 7 habits of highly effective people. And one of those habits is seek first to understand, and he talks pretty explicitly in there about like you said, like the repeating back, like, this is what I heard you say. Is that right? And I use that with my kids all the time. Like, if I feel myself kind of getting anxious or maybe a little frustrated, and I'm even thinking about my hands right now, like I'm wanting to clench fists, right? And so whenever I have that feeling kind of coming up, like I always kind of come back to my Stephen Covey 7 habits and seek first to understand. And so, like, is this what I heard you say? Like, just because I want the clarity, right? But it also is an indicator to you that I'm paying attention, that I'm listening, right? And then, like you said, then it cues them up to say, like, okay, now I can go a little bit further. And I also like this idea of just, like, okay, now I've learned that, like, this really could potentially go down a non-peaceable path, and sometimes, like sometimes we go there, and even though we know, like, the flags are, the flags are coming up, like we're going into conflict zone. And sometimes it's okay to go into those conflict zones, and sometimes it's just, maybe it's not appropriate. Maybe there's kids around, maybe there's, and I'll say, like, full transparency, and like totally owning up and taking responsibility. Like, I've gone there with family before when my kids were present, and it was ugly. Like, and then I had to come home and sit with my kids and talk it through and explain what had happened. And, and then, like, take the level 4 responsibility and really be honest about, like, okay, this is maybe where I messed up along this line of, like, these are people that we love. This is our family, and it's okay to disagree. What's not okay is to let it get to a point where it's explosive and everybody's just walking away feeling really hurt.
Yes. And I think it's okay to, if you're in step 4 here, trying to decide whether to engage or disengage, it's okay to just verbally, because it brings some resolve to you to just say, I don't agree with what you're saying, but I think that, we don't need to continue this. By the way, ask a different question,
Yeah.
Another thing about parroting back what people say, I think it also gives our own minds a chance to kind of cool down, lower our own blood pressure.
Yeah.
So it actually works for our benefit as well as their benefit, because then they think, like you said, they're really listening, really getting listened to. So you're in this moment where you're just, you've taken the pulse and decided whether this is a safe conversation to engage in, or it's really just best not to. If you decide to engage, that's when it's your turn to say, well, you probably know I don't have the same political view. Can I share with you, my thoughts? Sometimes it's best to even just ask permission. And then, just share what you think, but you don't want to turn it into a debate, because then it's just going to go in the wrong direction. And hopefully, since you've already modeled, these active listening skills toward them, they might surprise you and do the same with you. I have gotten into so step 5 is where you put relationships over politics, exactly what you said. And I have been in a conversation where the other person was really antagonizing me and wanting to ramp it up. And I just kept repeating, you know what, I don't agree with you. Well, how can you not agree with me? Da 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 da, fact, fact, fact. And I'm like, I'm sorry, I don't believe that that's true. And so I was holding my own, but I wasn't escalating. And then I finally just said, you know what? I put this relationship over this discussion or over politics, and I am choosing not to engage in it. I value you, and I actually and this was a person who was appropriate to say I love you, and I put this relationship over this discussion. End of topic. And it worked, and it wasn't easy because they really wanted to escalate. And so those are my my 5 tips. And yeah,
I love.
it takes a lot of practice, really.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of like relating this conversation to, to school and our work with youth, and even as a parent, it makes me think a lot of restorative practices, and really restorative practices and restorative justice. It's really about putting relationships first, right? Like at the core, restorative practices, which is, it's about relationship building. It's about healing from harms that have been done. It's about hearing each other out. It's about an opportunity for you to share your experience on an event that happened. It's really about putting relationships first. And before all of this, everything was fine, right? If you're kind of in the situation where, like, before this election season came up, like, we were all fine, and that's an interesting thing to look at too, because I think especially now with Black Lives Matter and where we're going, there's a lot of questions around, like, well, which side of history are you going to be on, right? Like, which side of history are you going to stand on? And it's a tough place to be right now, because I understand, on one side, I really understand that it's a time for us to take a stand on what we really believe in, and I believe that people all over this country are doing that. And at the same token, are we so willing to throw away relationships and not work through them around really big issues that are really important and valuable for us? And I understand that, I mean, I've heard a lot of stories for, people who have ended relationships, right? Because they're not, neither of them, right, are willing to work on the relationship and examine the relationship first, so that they can come to a level of understanding. And I know a lot of people have really tried. And you get to a point where it's like, okay, this is never going to go anywhere. And so maybe it is best that the relationship ends. Maybe we aren't the people that we thought we were, and that situation happens too. And I think what's most important is that we, like you said in the beginning, we don't take things in a broad stroke. We don't just assume that because you're a Republican or because you're white or because whatever, like, fill in the blank, that you are this way, and therefore we can or cannot be friends. We can and cannot have a can or cannot have a relationship. And instead of just making these big assumptions, that we really do take the time to, ask ourselves these really important questions, like you're saying,
Yeah. Sometimes we take our passion for the big movement and we move it into this one-on-one transaction, where at the end of the day, if you really did bring that person over to your side, the truth is that you have not saved the world. Sorry. I mean, and the fact is that you're 99.9% not going to bring them over to your side. So you have to just deal with them on, like you said, on that relational individual level. And then you have to decide, is this, like a couple would, is this so important to me that they believe exactly what I believe, that I can't continue this relationship. I mean, there are valid reasons to do that, but I do think that we take our big passion and then we try to translate that right over to our individual relationships, and it's not a good translation, and we need to back up from that, and kind of just, like I said, step back from that and unravel that. And you got to look at the fact that the brain is involved here and it's wired differently. You're not going to change that.
Yeah. Good stuff, Julie.
Thank you.
Really good stuff. I mean, really like practical tips too. How have you seen these tips or these steps playing out? Like, do you have, I'm just thinking of like, where did these do you practice these steps on a regular basis? Do you have a story of like when it worked and when it didn't work, or like, do you, how do you teach these steps? But, you know what I mean?
I think something that I have had quite a political evolution in my life, kind of from one side to more to the middle and then more. And I think because of that, I am fortunate to have friendships that are very diverse in terms of politics. And so I have had, the opportunity, to use this a lot. I also think that I have been worried about the state of our political rhetoric and what it's doing in terms of the us against them vibe since, at least 2010. And then going to the Croc school with you and learning about, like in Rwanda, where they just kept broadcasting over and over and over again on the radio, through the media, these people are bad, these people are bad, or people are bad. And then, okay, they dehumanize them, and so that you don't even think of the other side as human anymore. And then one day someone just blows the whistle and says, go kill them. And it's not hard to do.
Yeah.
And that scares me. I don't want to see us do that. That's why I keep saying, I keep focusing on relationships over politics.
Yeah. Yeah. My heart hurts, when we talk about that.
It's because you're passionate. And like you said, you want to, you have certain social justice issues that you really want to uphold. And we want everyone to agree with us. And our brain, rewards us for all that passion and trying to win the argument. But you kind of have to be a little bit counterintuitive in order to save the relationship. And I really believe that over time, if there is hope, we will listen to each other,
Yeah, I mean, and I'll just say this last thing too, like something that I grapple with a lot is like, there's a reason people believe things that they believe. And just like there's a reason that I believe what I believe. And if we're really at odds, if we're really in a divisive place, if we're really divided, then if I'm standing on this line and I'm as passionate as I am about X, and you're standing on the other side of the line and you're just as passionate about Y, then like where's my responsibility in understanding the stance that you take, and what am I willing to do to understand that stance? And as people like you and I who've done a lot of work in peace and justice and a lot of studying around peace and justice, we see like reconciliation talks, and we see these things that like brings communities together because they're focusing on the relationships, right? They're focusing on the relationships first. And it's okay to disagree. What's not okay, obviously, is when people are being harmed. You're talking about Rwanda and genocide and, there's a lot that we can say about civil unrest in this country right now too. It's not just political unrest, but the civil unrest is, there are a lot of people being harmed. And so in those circumstances, it's harder for me to see the other side, and it fuels the fire. Yeah.
I think the simple question there really is, if you could say to any one of those people on the other side, or if you had a way to see into their soul or their brain, what happened? What happened to you that has brought you to this place? If you knew the answer to that for each of those people, I think we'd all have more empathy.
Yeah. Yeah.
I
I mean,
really
and
do.
it's really true because I've gone through this, just like I've said before, like with my own family through the course of this year. And, definitely since the murder of George Floyd and all of the uprising and the protests that turned into, just destruction and rioting. There was a lot of conversations within our family compound, just and it took a lot for us to be able to say, okay, like our I don't know, not anxiety, but just our frustration, right? It was like we got to a point where we really just couldn't even talk, period. Right? Not even about the weather. It's just like we couldn't even talk. And once, we gave ourselves a little bit of a time to get through that, and we were able to come together and say, okay, let's sit down in the garden and have a one-on-one conversation. And please help me understand why we keep butting heads around this issue. And I'll tell you, I learned a lot from my family members around why they have such a tight grip on things, and I think they understood a little bit too around why I have such a tight grip on things too. But I definitely, like you're saying, this is really about empathy. Like I had, like they were raised in a certain era, in a certain time, and had certain experiences that I will never be able to relate to because I wasn't born then,
Right.
And so it doesn't excuse certain things, but it does help us build empathy on our own journey.
Mm-hmm. Yes. There's always a backstory. I think what we don't realize is people feel bullied by whatever systems they live in. They feel much more insecure than we recognize. And so then when they do something we don't agree with, we're like, what's wrong with you? And it's like, there is a backstory there for everything.
Yeah. And I mean, we can kind of, we're going on today, Julie, but, I mean, something like, bringing it back to politics, I know we're kind of bouncing between several different topics and social justice issues and, but it always coming back to relationships first.
Mm-hmm.
When we were going through the last election, I was still in the classroom and I was working with 8th graders, and I was at a school that, was like 98% Latinx. It was, predominantly low income community. And all of those students, all of my students were Latinx, and many of them were undocumented, and many of them were immigrants. And so there was so much tension and anxiety around that election. And for the first time in all of my years teaching, where we went through election cycles, never had my students cared before, and all of a sudden I was in a classroom with my kids, like walking in the door, fired up to talk about politics. And it really took me back. Like, I'm not used to this as an educator, like, teaching middle school. My students never really cared before, and all of a sudden these kids were just fired up and they had a lot to say. And, so are those kids voting this? They're not. I mean,
Eighth grade, 13, 14 years old, they might be.
Some of them may be voting now, which is crazy too. But I saw some statistics around the number of young people who are showing up at the polls has gone up by like 3 or 4 times, which I just want to give a shout out to all those, whatever side they're voting for, but just the fact that they're taking action and showing up. It gives me chills. Like, it really gives me chills. So I think this is an important conversation to have, especially with our young people too. Like, again, in the kitchen, right? So much happens at home. In the kitchen the other night at our Sunday dinner, my nephew, there was there was a Trump ad that came up, and my nephew made a comment about like, I don't know, how dare anybody vote for Trump? And, here's grandpa down on the ground, like trying to fix the ice machine or something. And he turns around and looks at him and says, I voted for Trump. And that really shut my nephew down, because like, I don't think he even realized that they're within our own home, right? Within our own family, that people can be standing on multiple sides. So and then I saw my mom later that evening, like pull him down into the hallway to have like a one-on-one conversation with him. And it was very peaceful, but she really, I don't know what she said, but I could feel the energy of it. And, it's just a really pivotal time for our young people and all of this too. And like, how are we being models for them? Like you said earlier on in the conversation of like, we talk about bullying and anti-bullying campaigns in our classrooms and on our school campuses, and yet in our homes, like, as soon as we get into politics, we become like our worst fifth grade bully ever, right? Like, it's just these things are just so important, like how we show up, in these spaces when we're working with youth. It's important stuff.
Well, I think you hit on it on the head. It was good that Grandpa said, hey, I voted for Trump, because I think the future of this is that we create a new value out of bipartisanship. And that doesn't mean we have to agree with each other's approaches, but that we really honor each other and we honor the process, and we start looking for things that we all have in common. At this point, it's sad that at the people who represent us at the highest levels cannot exhibit that behavior. And we have to say, we're done. This is not okay.
Yeah.
And I hope that is what the younger generation is here to do. And I think they are, is to say, this is ridiculous.
Yeah. I mean, always as educators, as professionals, as mentors, as just, older people with the authority, right? I mean, let's face it, like we have the authority and we have the influence. So how are we modeling that relationships come first, right? Like seek first to understand, like gain, building a relationship with you and asking you questions that might be, having uncomfortable conversations will help me build empathy so that I can understand where you're coming from, and vice versa, so that you can understand where I'm coming from too.
Absolutely. And that's basically why I wrote, the memoir, to highlight that I had a friendship with my political opposite for over 30 years, and we navigated it. And this is the story of how we navigated that. And, I hope it gives other people some hope, because it's possible.
Yeah, that's amazing. Well, thank you, Julie. And I adore you. And I'm going to go ahead and see if I can stop the live stream, and then you just hang on the line. Okay.
Okay.